Charleston, 1841. The heavens break open. In the lantern-lit hush of Langston's stables, a stranger collapses into straw, mud on her hem, fever on her lips, and a name she cannot give. He finds her, a man forged by duty, promised to a duchess, staring into eyes that threaten everything he was born to protect. Rumor gathers like rain on stone. A secret waits behind locked doors, one that could shatter a house or save a heart. Tonight begins a battle between reputation and redemption, between the vow made in public and the truth whispered in the dark. Tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about period romances? The forbidden longing, the grand houses, or the second chances? Charleston, South Carolina, the year of our Lord, 1841. The heavens wept that night, as if mourning some forgotten sorrow, and the wind howled through the trees like a wounded beast. The vast lands of the Langston estate, once quiet, orderly, and untouched by the chaos of emotion, were lashed by sheets of cold rain. Lanterns flickered within the stables, the only place where warmth dared to exist amidst the storm's fury. Beneath the angry downpour, she appeared. A silhouette, trembling and fragile, stumbled through the mud-soaked path like a ghost no one had summoned. Her muslin dress, once the color of fresh cream, was now darkened by filth and rain, clinging to her thin form with cruel indifference. Clara Whitlow, daughter of fallen Grace, collapsed into the straw-strewn floor of the stable without a cry, her breath shallow, her limbs trembling from fever and exhaustion. She had no memory of how far she had walked, or for how long she had been fleeing shadows from a past that would not release her. Her boots, soaked through and split at the seams, offered no protection. Her hair, a tangled crown of dark chestnut, stuck to her pale cheeks like dying vines. With her last ounce of strength, she reached for the warmth of the horses, not to ride, but to hide. Then darkness claimed her. It was near midnight when Edward Langston, master of the estate, returned from his tour of the lower grounds. A man of 36 winters, broad of shoulder and stern of bearing. He was unaccustomed to being surprised on his own land. Yet as he stepped into the stable, guided only by instinct and the lantern in his gloved hand, he paused. There, between the stalls, lying in a mixture of straw and soaked earth, was a woman. She did not move, though her chest still rose and fell. At first he believed her to be a vagrant or perhaps a mad woman sent by the storm. But as he knelt beside her, the light revealed more. The curve of her face was delicate, her hands bruised but refined, her lashes long and trembling against her cheeks. There was nobility in her features, but they had been weathered by ruin. He should have called for the constable, or the servants, or anyone but himself, but something in the silence between them, her breath, faint and stubborn, the way her fingers curled as if resisting death, made him hesitate. He touched her shoulder gently. "Miss?" he asked, low and cautious. She did not reply. Her body was ice. Without another word, Edward lifted her in his arms. She was feather-light, like something forgotten by the world. The rain fell harder as he carried her across the gravel path and into the servants' wing through the back corridor, careful to avoid notice. Inside, by the low warmth of the kitchen hearth, Miriam, one of the older maids, gasped at the sight of the stranger in her master's arms. "She's burning with fever," Edward murmured, already placing her upon the small cot kept for emergencies. "Clean her, keep her warm, and give her broth when she wakes. She's not to be spoken of. Not a word, Miriam." The woman's lips parted to protest, but Edward's gaze silenced her. She bowed her head and obeyed. Upstairs, the Langston house remained a monument of restraint and propriety. The windows rattled softly in the storm, and the silver candlesticks stood rigid upon mantels that had not seen laughter in years. Edward ascended the stairs without a sound, his jaw set, his eyes dark. He entered his study and poured a measure of brandy, though it brought him no warmth. By morning, the estate would be busy again. Servants would prepare for the arrival of Duchess Vivian Ashcroft, his intended. The invitations had already been delivered. Society waited. Duty loomed. But in the shadows of the house, near the warmth of the kitchen fire, a stranger lay wrapped in blankets that smelled of soap and smoke, feverish, silent, and entirely out of place. And though neither Edward Langston nor Clara Whitlow knew it yet, nothing in Langston House would remain untouched by her presence, not even the man who once believed he had buried his heart beneath the soil of honor and silence. The morning after, the storm did not bring calm. Though the sky cleared over Charleston, and a timid sun attempted to dry the wounded earth, a heavy hush clung to Langston House, a silence not born of peace, but of tension still unsaid. Clara Whitlow awoke with a start, her limbs trembling under the coarse weight of unfamiliar blankets. The smell of ash, lye soap and barley broth lingered in the air, unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. Her fever had broken, though her body still ached as if each bone had fought to survive the night. She blinked, struggling to recognize her surroundings. The room was small and dim, its walls rough and whitewashed. A narrow window revealed the first rays of sunlight breaking over the trees beyond the servants' courtyard. A low fire crackled beside her, and somewhere nearby she could hear the clatter of iron pans and the murmured rhythms of a kitchen preparing for the day. Her breath caught in her throat. This was not a boarding house, nor an inn, and certainly not the poorhouse, where she had feared she would awaken next. She sat up too quickly and winced, pressing a hand to her temple. Her fingers grazed the bandage on her brow, then fell over the fabric of a freshly laundered nightgown. Simple, but not her own. A woman entered, broad-shouldered and stern, her graying hair tied back tightly beneath a linen cap. She moved like someone who had long commanded obedience. She carried a tray in her hands and placed it on the small table beside the bed without a word. Then, folding her arms across her black wool bodice, she examined Clara with the cold detachment of a surgeon preparing to operate. "You're awake," she said at last. "About time." Clara, still dizzy, nodded once. Her voice was buried somewhere in her chest. The woman continued, "You were found near death in the stables. His lordship brought you in himself. That alone raises questions." His lordship. The words struck like a bell. The man from the night before, the one with the storm in his eyes and the silence of judgment in his voice, was no farmer, no hired hand, a landowner, a gentleman, and she had collapsed like a beggar in his stables. "I'm Mrs. Penelope Graves," the woman said, her voice clipped and sharp. "Head housekeeper." "And you are?" Clara hesitated. In that pause, barely the length of a breath, her entire past unfurled in her mind like a condemned tapestry. The courtroom, the whispers, the auction of the last family heirlooms, her mother's silence, the sound of boots walking away forever. Her name, once spoken with reverence in salons and drawing rooms, now echoed only in disgrace. To utter it here would mean ruin, for herself, perhaps even for the man who had lifted her from the straw. "I don't have a name," Clara whispered. Mrs. Graves narrowed her eyes. "Everyone has a name." "Then I've forgotten mine." The housekeeper's mouth twisted slightly in what might have been disdain or pity. She studied Clara in silence for several moments, then gave a brisk nod, as if resolving to allow the matter to pass. "For now. You're to rest a few hours more," she said. "Then you'll earn your bread like the rest of us. You may help in the kitchens until further notice. Speak little. Keep your head down." Clara lowered her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Once Mrs. Graves had left, Clara reached beneath the cot, her fingers trembling as they searched the lining of the satchel they had returned to her. She felt it, hidden within the seam. The brooch, oval-shaped, delicate, tarnished by time, but still intact. A golden frame encasing a miniature portrait, her mother as a girl, painted by her father's own hand. It was the only piece of her past she had not sold or lost, and it could cost her everything. Later that morning, as the estate awoke with the careful orchestration of a household preparing for the visit of a duchess, Clara was shown the scullery. The copper pots gleamed in rows, and the windows, though high and narrow, let in a stream of golden light that made even soap water look merciful. She was given a rough cotton apron and a bar of lye. No questions were asked, but she felt every eye measure her, from the young kitchen maids to the older scullion boys. She sensed their curiosity, their judgment, and something else, wariness. But one pair of eyes met hers without suspicion. Nate Booker, the stable hand, paused near the back entrance, wiping his hands on a cloth. His sandy hair was still damp from the morning chores, and his freckles stood out against his sun-warmed skin. He offered her a smile, not bold, but kind, and when no one was watching, slipped something onto the ledge near the pump. Clara glanced down. A pair of soft, patched gloves and a crust of bread wrapped in cloth. She dared not look at him as she whispered, "Thank you." He tipped his head slightly, then returned to the stables, his boots wet from the grass, leaving no trace behind but a kindness Clara would not forget. By the time midday came, Clara's fingers were red and sore, her arms aching from scrubbing hearthstones and lifting heavy pots. But the motion helped her mind remain still. There was something oddly comforting in silence and labor. When no one knew your name, no one could condemn you. At dusk, as the servants dined on stew in the lower hall, Clara was summoned. She was led by a young footman through a back corridor, away from the kitchen, smoke and noise. The carpet muffled their steps, gilded frames lined the walls, and the air was scented faintly with tobacco and polished wood. They stopped before a heavy oak door. The footman knocked once and opened it. Edward Langston stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette tall and still against the dying light. The drawing room was sparse, masculine, lined with dark books and heavy furniture. A fire smoldered in the grate. He did not turn immediately. "You're well enough to stand," he said at last. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice quiet but steady. He turned then. In the glow of the setting sun, Edward's features looked carved in stone, hard, regal, but not unkind. His grey-blue eyes studied her with a calm intensity that made her blood stir and her spine stiffen. He did not move closer, nor did he invite her to sit. "I've told the staff you're a new hire," he said. "A maid sent by my steward's wife. No one will question it. For now." Clara lowered her gaze. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said, stepping forward slowly. "I only want to know what you're running from." She met his eyes, and something in the silence that followed held more weight than any confession could have. "I've run from what cannot be undone," she answered at last. "My name no longer belongs to me. It belongs to shame, to scandal, to graves and debts and lies I did not create." Edward said nothing, but he did not look away. He crossed the room and stopped only when he stood near enough to see the fine tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders rose and fell with carefully measured breath. Yet he did not touch her. The distance between them was both a shield and a promise. "Then keep your name," he said, "whatever it may be." Clara blinked, surprised. He continued, his voice lower now. "Here, you are what you choose to be. But be warned. Truth has a way of finding those who bury it." She nodded, unable to speak. He stepped back. "You may go." As she turned to leave, her heart ached, not with fear, but with the strange and unfamiliar burden of having been seen, not as a criminal, not as a fallen daughter, but as something closer to human. That night, as the rest of the house slumbered beneath layers of lace, velvet, and silence, Clara returned to her narrow cot in the servants' wing. She lay still, eyes open, one hand curled protectively around the brooch hidden beneath her mattress. A name she could not give, a life she could no longer claim, and a man whose gaze had already unsettled everything she had sworn never to feel again. The sun rose with solemn ceremony on the third day, casting a golden veil over the red-bricked facade of Langston House. Its columns stood proud against the backdrop of sprawling oak trees, their branches still dripping from the storm that had passed. The estate, though accustomed to silence, now vibrated with an air of expectation so potent it seemed even the birds dared not sing too loudly. Servants bustled through corridors with purposeful steps. Silver was polished until it shone like new coin. Crystal decanters were inspected under the morning light, and the scent of rosewater mingled with beeswax and nervous sweat. Curtains were drawn with precision. Flowers, freshly plucked from the gardens, were arranged in vases with obsessive care. Every detail mattered, for on this day, Langston House would receive its future mistress. Duchess Vivian Ashcroft was to arrive before the hour of noon. She was not a woman easily pleased. In the lower wing, Clara moved quietly through the scullery. Sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands red from scrubbing. Her arms ached, but she welcomed the pain. It grounded her, reminded her that she still belonged to the realm of the living. Around her, the younger maids whispered with frantic delight about the Duchess's beauty, her wealth, her pearls, her gowns from Paris. Clara remained silent, her eyes lowered, her heart guarded. By mid-morning, Mrs. Graves appeared at the kitchen door, her presence abrupt as a storm wind. She swept her sharp gaze over the room, her voice cutting clean through the clatter of pans, and whispered gossip. "All servants to the main hall. Now, his lordship has requested a formal welcome." Clara's pulse quickened, but she followed the others, taking care to stand near the back of the line, her face shadowed beneath her cap. The great doors were opened. A black carriage, gleaming like polished coal, rolled into view. Its wheels did not creak, and its windows were curtained in violet silk. A liveried footman jumped down and opened the door with reverence. And then she emerged. Vivian Ashcroft descended like a figure carved from alabaster and trained to glide. Her traveling gown, a deep emerald velvet, clung to her frame with elegant weight. Her hat was adorned with jet feathers that shimmered in the morning light, and her gloves, black as ink, clutched a delicate fan with ivory ribs. Her beauty was sharp, untouched by warmth, her chin slightly lifted in a manner that demanded silence without speech. She did not look at the servants, not directly. Her eyes swept over them with the disinterest of one surveying a painting too familiar to study. But when they passed over Clara, only for a second, they lingered. Not in recognition, but in curiosity. A thread pulled taut, though neither woman yet knew why. Edward stepped forward, bowing slightly, his expression composed. He extended his hand, and Vivian placed hers into it without hesitation. "You're late," he said softly, though not unkindly. "Only fashionably," she replied, her voice like chilled wine. She allowed him to guide her into the house, their silhouettes moving together like actors upon a stage both too large and too empty. The doors closed behind them, and the servants were dismissed. Clara exhaled, but the air in the house had changed. For the remainder of the day, Clara kept to simple tasks, dusting shelves, sweeping corridors, oiling the wooden banisters that curved like ribbons through the halls. She avoided eye contact, worked with care, and listened. She heard laughter once, Vivian's voice, controlled and cool, yet unmistakably practiced. She heard Edward's reply, lower, unreadable. She passed them once in the upper corridor, her eyes fixed on the floor as they walked past, the scent of lilac and cedar trailing behind them. Vivian did not speak, but Clara felt the Duchess's eyes on her back, like the brush of a blade. In the library, where she was sent to clean the hearth and dust the baseboards, Clara moved in silence. She dared not disturb the order of the books, though her fingers itched to trace the spines. They stood like soldiers, proud and dustless, arranged by topic and lineage, but one lay slightly ajar on the small writing desk by the window, a volume of poetry, Byron, bound in navy leather, its edges worn with use. She glanced around. No one. Drawn by something she could not name, she picked up the book and turned a page. The words rose to meet her like an old friend, long lost. She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. Her lips parted. She did not speak the words aloud, but she let them echo within her. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and in that moment, she was not a maid, not a stranger, not a shadow. She was Clara Whitlow, daughter of a painter and a pianist, raised among verses and ink and the tender rustle of pages at dusk, a noise behind her. She turned, startled, and found Nate standing in the doorway, holding a feather duster and blinking like someone caught mid-thought. His shirt was damp with effort, his sleeves rolled, his freckles dark against the sunburn on his neck. "You like books," he said, not as a question, but as an understanding. Clara placed the volume down gently. "Yes," he smiled. "I like stories too, though I don't always catch the meaning." She met his gaze, surprised by the candor. Meaning comes with time. Before he could reply, Mrs. Graves entered from the hall, her eyes sharp as ever. She looked at Clara, then at the book, then at Nate. "Books are not for idle hands," she said, "especially not hands that scrub floors. Back to your duties." They obeyed. Nate offered Clara a final glance before slipping away, and Clara returned to her bucket with a heart that beat too loudly for the silence it kept. That evening, after the supper bells had rung and the house began to settle, Clara walked the corridor leading back to the servants' wing. The candlelight flickered against the paneled walls. She thought of poetry, of books unread, and of the voice of a man who did not look at her as if she were nothing. But as she turned the corner, she nearly collided with the Duchess. Vivian stood alone in the hallway, holding a crystal glass in her hand. Her gown was changed to one of silver-blue silk, embroidered with jet beads that caught the candlelight like stars. Her hair was swept into a perfect coil. Her eyes, green and unreadable, settled on Clara. "You are new," she said calmly. Clara dropped into a curtsy, her voice steady only by force of will. "Yes, Your Grace." Vivian studied her, not her uniform, not the dust on her apron, but her face. "I've seen you before," she mused. "Somewhere." Clara kept her head bowed. "I don't believe so, Your Grace." "Perhaps not." Vivian sipped from her glass. "But you read." A pause. Clara said nothing. "Books leave a trace," the Duchess continued, "in the way a person carries silence. In the way they look at doors that are closed to them." Clara remained still. Vivian smiled faintly. It was not kind. "I shall remember you," she said. And with that, she disappeared into the darkness of the corridor, her perfume lingering like an accusation. That night, Clara returned to her cot with a weight upon her chest she could not name. The world above stairs was shifting, and the storm that had brought her here had not truly passed. It merely waited for a quieter moment to strike again, and far above her, in the grand rooms where secrets were spoken behind crystal and lace, the Duchess sat at her vanity, gazing not into her mirror, but into memory, and she too remembered. The morning of the garden fete dawned warm and golden, as if the heavens themselves had been bribed into granting a day of flawless grace. Not a single cloud marred the sky, and the air carried a soft perfume of magnolia, honeysuckle, and roses in full bloom. It was the kind of southern day that shimmered with deceptive sweetness, the kind of beauty that hid tension beneath its lace gloves and parasol shadows. Langston House had been transformed into a tableau of opulence. White linen tents had been erected over the lawn, their edges dancing lightly in the breeze. Musicians tuned their violins beneath an arbor covered in climbing jasmine. Tables were set with gleaming silver, crystal glasses, and imported porcelain painted with violets. Servants moved like clockwork, trays balanced in precise formation, faces composed to invisibility. Inside the servants' hall, Clara adjusted her borrowed uniform. The dress fit awkwardly at the shoulders and was too tight at the waist, but there had been no time for alterations. Her apron was crisp, her cap secured with pins, and her hands, though trembling slightly, were clean and steady. Mrs. Graves inspected her without affection, but with an approving nod. "You will carry wine," she said. "No speaking unless spoken to. No lingering near the guests. Do not look them in the eye." "Yes, ma'am," Clara murmured. And so she stepped into a world she once knew from the other side of the curtain. The gardens swelled with guests. Women in organza gowns the color of spring petals, men in finely tailored coats and top hats, children darting between hedges with laughter too bright to be ignored. Laughter, however, did not reach Clara's heart. She walked between tables like a wisp of shadow, a silent observer to a life that had once whispered promises in her ear, only to snatch them away. She did not see Edward at first. She felt him. Somewhere between the fountain and the conservatory, she sensed the weight of his gaze as surely as if it had brushed her cheek. When she finally dared to glance his way, he stood near the musicians, speaking to a colonel with a waxed moustache, but his eyes flickered just for a moment in her direction. And in that flicker, something unspoken passed between them. Clara turned away quickly, her heart beating too fast for someone who had not yet spoken a word. A group of ladies nearby whispered beneath their parasols, voices low, but their tones unmistakably mocking. "Did you see her? She's not from here. Too pale for field work. Too pretty to have scrubbed much floor. I heard his lordship found her wandering. More likely she was paid to wander in at the right time." Laughter, soft and poisonous, rippled like silk torn underfoot. Clara kept walking. Her tray did not shake. The moment came quickly and without grace. A young maid, Eliza, rushed to fill a crystal glass and, in her haste, knocked it over, spilling wine onto the pale gown of a woman whose wealth was rivaled only by her cruelty. The lady gasped. "You stupid girl." Eliza froze. Her face paled. She stammered an apology, voice trembling. And then came the slap. Sharp, precise, delivered with the back of a gloved hand that left a red mark upon the girl's cheek. Time slowed. Clara stepped forward before she had time to question herself. "Pardon me, madam," she said, her voice low but clear. "It was an accident." The woman turned, her lips parted in disdain. "And who are you to speak?" Clara looked her in the eyes. For the first time in days, she did not look away. "I am a servant of this house," she replied, "and as such I ask that its guests show no less civility than is expected of those who serve them." There was a hush. The violin stopped. A few guests gasped audibly. Somewhere in the silence, china clinked softly as a spoon was set down with caution. The lady's nostrils flared. "You will regret that tone." Clara curtsied with exquisite poise. "Perhaps, but better to regret truth than live ashamed of silence." She turned and took Eliza gently by the arm, guiding her away without another word. From across the lawn, Edward Langston watched, his expression unreadable. Vivian Ashcroft, standing beside him with a glass of champagne, narrowed her eyes ever so slightly. The party resumed. The musicians began again. But something had shifted. The silk of appearances had been scorched, just slightly, but enough to reveal a glimpse of the fire beneath. That night the estate returned to quiet. Candles were snuffed, dishes cleaned. The moon rose silver and detached over the now silent tents. Clara could not sleep. Drawn by a force she did not fully understand, she rose from her narrow bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Her bare feet made no sound as she walked the cold stone corridor, past sleeping chambers and closed doors, until she reached the library. The door creaked faintly as she pushed it open. Inside, the fire had been left burning low. Shadows danced across shelves, lined with ancient knowledge and forgotten dreams. The room smelled of leather bindings and beeswax and memory. She walked slowly between the rows of books, her fingers trailing lightly along the spines. She stopped at a familiar volume, Keats this time. She took it down and opened to a random page. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." She closed her eyes. "You handle books like they might vanish if you breathe too loudly." The voice behind her startled her, not with fear but with recognition. Edward stood near the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, the other at his side. He had removed his coat and waistcoat, and the flickering light cast golden shadows across the sharp lines of his face. "I didn't know anyone was here," she said softly. "I find it difficult to sleep after garden parties," he replied. She replaced the book gently. "I find it difficult to sleep after being reminded of who I no longer am." He said nothing for a moment, then, "You surprised them." Clara turned to face him. "I did not mean to. You surprised me," he added more quietly. She looked at him then, not as a servant to a master, but as one soul to another, both burdened by invisible chains. "I only spoke what others were too afraid to say," she murmured. He approached slowly, until the distance between them was just enough to still be called propriety. But the air between them was thick with something neither dared name. "There's a fire in you," he said, "one the world has tried to extinguish." She met his gaze, her voice barely above a breath. "Then why do I feel so cold?" He studied her a long moment, as if memorizing her sorrow. Then gently he said, "Because you've forgotten how to burn." Clara's eyes glistened, though no tear fell. "I had everything once," she whispered. "And then, nothing." Edward's voice dropped to a hush. "You are not nothing." She turned away, overcome, but he did not leave. Nor did he touch her. He simply stood beside her in silence, and for a moment the world felt less sharp. Meanwhile, in the quiet of her own chambers, Mrs. Penelope Graves lit a candle and unlocked a small wooden box beneath her writing desk. She retrieved the brooch she had taken earlier that day from Clara's satchel hidden beneath her cot. She turned it over slowly, studying the delicate engraving on the back. A crest, faded but unmistakable. One she had not seen in over 20 years. Her lips pressed into a line, and her mind whispered of scandal long buried, now stirring once more in the ashes of silk. The days that followed the garden fete passed like slow-moving clouds, still uncertain and heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Though the sun continued to bathe Langston House in golden warmth, there was a shift beneath the surface, a subtle rearrangement of glances, silences, and proximity. Edward Langston had grown quiet, not the silence of calculation or strategy, but something softer, something heavier. He answered Vivian's inquiries with courteous brevity, fulfilled his social obligations with dignified detachment, and retreated to his study earlier and earlier each evening. He had become a man present in body and nowhere else. Vivian noticed. She was not a woman who failed to read absence. She saw it in the way he no longer reached for her hand when escorting her through the halls, in how his voice did not rise in warmth when speaking her name, in how, when he looked toward the gardens, he did not see the roses, but something far beyond them. Vivian did not speak of it. She waited, as vipers do, in stillness. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of the estate, Clara Whitlow remained dutiful and invisible, or at least she tried. She polished the banisters, swept the vestibule, changed linens with precision, and scrubbed stone floors with silent grace. But there was no longer peace in her anonymity. Whispers followed her like the train of a forgotten gown. The events of the garden party had left a mark, not just in the minds of the guests, but in the hearts of those who served beside her. Some admired her, others resented her, but no one ignored her, and neither did Edward. He did not speak to her beyond what duty required, but he watched her, sometimes from the balcony, sometimes from behind the pages of a book he had ceased reading. He listened to her footsteps in the corridor. He noticed the way her fingers curled when folding linens, how she paused near the library door as if listening for music that no longer played. He had begun to wonder, not just about who she was, but about who he was when he looked at her. One late afternoon, while inspecting repairs near the east wing, Edward stepped into the attic. It was not a place he frequented. The space smelled of old wood and forgotten things. Dust floated in beams of light that slipped through the slats in the roof. He walked slowly, brushing aside cobwebs, his boots creaking on the warped floorboards. At the far end of the room, covered in a faded sheet, stood a tall, narrow object leaning against the wall. A painting. He pulled back the cloth. It took his breath. The portrait, though unsigned, was unmistakably his mother, Lady Eleanor Langston, yet not as he remembered her. This was not the regal, composed woman who had guided him through society's rituals and whispered to him of legacy and duty. This was a girl, young, radiant, full of secret laughter, with wind-blown hair and eyes that had not yet learned to hide pain. The style was unfamiliar to him, delicate, intuitive, filled with soul. Below the hem of the canvas, barely visible, a name was scratched faintly into the wood. Whitlow. Edward stepped back. A strange coldness settled in his chest, not of fear, but of connection. Later that evening, Clara was in the garden alone, tending to the ivy near the stone wall that separated the formal rose beds from the more modest vegetable plots. She wore a shawl over her dress, her hands covered in soil, her mind far from the earth she touched. Edward watched her from the terrace. She looked up, sensing his presence. Their eyes met, and for one breathless second, there was no garden, no estate, no titles, no shadows, only two people tethered to a moment they could not name. He did not go to her. He turned and left. That night, Clara sat in the servants' hall after supper, mending a tear in her apron. Across the room, Nate Booker leaned against the window ledge, a folded letter in his hands. He looked uncertain. "I need help," he admitted, voice low. Clara looked up. "My brother wrote again," Nate continued. "Says he's found work in Savannah. Wants me to come, maybe. But I can't read all the words." Clara set down her needle. He approached and handed her the letter, his calloused fingers brushing hers. She unfolded it slowly and read in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were soft. "He's working at a shipyard," she said. "The hours are long, but he says the pay is good. He misses you." Nate exhaled. "He writes pretty, don't he?" "He writes like someone who believes in hope," she replied. They smiled. And in that moment, under the yellow glow of the oil lamp, Clara realized she had not felt useful in a long time. Not like this, not with something she had carried since girlhood, a love of words, of teaching, of connecting thought to thought with nothing but ink and breath. "Would you like me to help you write back?" she asked. Nate nodded, grateful. Mrs. Graves watched them from the doorway, her face unreadable. Later that evening, alone in her room, Penelope Graves sat at her desk and unlatched the small wooden box. Inside, the brooch lay wrapped in linen. She took it out and studied it under the candlelight. The crest on the back, a stylized W woven into a laurel wreath, stirred memories long buried. She rose and went to her shelves, pulling out a stack of old newsletters from Charleston society, yellowed, fragile. She flipped through until she found the piece she remembered. A scandal, years old. A painter named Whitlow, accused of fraud, a forged signature, a ruined name, a family vanished. Her lips tightened. She folded the brooch in a fresh piece of cloth and placed it in a small envelope. Then, taking out paper and ink, she wrote a letter, brief, formal, and precise, to a lawyer in Charleston, an old acquaintance who owed her a favor. She sealed it, and in the quiet of her chambers, she whispered not a prayer, but a warning, because names, no matter how well hidden, had a way of crawling back from the grave. And if the girl downstairs was truly Clara Whitlow, then her presence in Langston House was not only a danger to herself, but to everyone who had ever dared to look at her with kindness. The days following Edward's discovery in the attic unfurled like pages of a forgotten diary, fragile, brittle, and heavy with ink long dried. The portrait of his mother, so young, so vividly alive, haunted him not just for what it showed, but for what it meant. Each brushstroke now carried a weight he could not ignore. He had not imagined the name. Beneath the dust and varnish, carved in quiet defiance along the wood's edge, was the signature that refused to vanish with time. Whitlow. It had not been added recently. It had always been there, only hidden like the truth itself. Unable to rest, Edward rode into town under the pale light of early morning. He brought the canvas, wrapped in linen and silence, to Mr. Cormac Bellamy, a respected dealer in art and scandal alike. Bellamy had once sold portraits to Edward's father. He was discreet, but not without a price. Bellamy, a slender man with eyes as sharp as the blades he used to trim paper, unwrapped the painting with reverence. His breath caught. "Elias Whitlow," he said almost immediately. "There's no doubt." Edward's stomach knotted. "You're certain?" "I'd stake my reputation on it," Bellamy replied, leaning closer. Before the scandal, before the accusations, he was one of the finest portraitists in the South. His brush knew emotion better than most men know their own wives. Edward's voice hardened. "And the accusations?" Bellamy sighed. "Forgery. 2 commissions claimed to be the work of a dead European master. He swore they were copies made for study. Others swore he'd signed them with intent to deceive. It was never proved, but the damage was done. And his death. Suicide. In his studio. Left behind a wife, a daughter, and a name that no one dared speak aloud. Edward left without another word. By the time he returned to Langston House, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like secrets across the gravel path. He did not change his coat. He did not wait. He went to the rose garden. Clara was there. She had removed her apron and was kneeling among the late-blooming roses, her hands in the soil, her hair pulled back with strands escaping in soft waves around her face. She looked up when she sensed him, and whatever color remained in her cheeks drained slowly away. He said nothing at first. She rose to her feet, brushing her hands on her skirt. "I wondered when this moment would come," she said quietly. "You knew I'd find it." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" She folded her arms across her waist, as if to hold herself together. "Because names are heavier than truth," she answered. "And because mine brings shame to every door it crosses." Edward stepped closer. "Elias Whitlow was your father." "Yes." "He painted my mother." "I know." He studied her, his voice caught between accusation and something softer. "So you came here on purpose?" Her eyes flashed, not with anger, but with pain. "No, I had no idea. I didn't know where I was. I had nowhere left." Silence stretched between them. Clara continued, her voice barely above the hum of the breeze. "All I wanted was to be forgotten, to be allowed to live without my father's shadow chasing every breath I take." Edward looked at her then, not as a servant, not as a mystery, but as a woman stripped of all pretense. A woman whose quiet strength had become a mirror to the man he might have been, had duty not hardened him. He exhaled. "I'm not asking you to explain his sins." "Good," she said, lifting her chin, "because I won't. He wasn't perfect, but he was more honest with his brush than most men are with their souls." Edward nodded once. "I won't tell anyone," he said. "Your secret stays with me." Clara's shoulders fell in a quiet release. "But," he added, and his voice trembled slightly, "I don't know what that means for us." Her gaze dropped. "There is no us, my lord." The way she said it, gently, without bitterness, stung more than if she'd shouted. He left her there among the roses, their petals wilting in the heat of the approaching dusk. That night, the house slept fitfully. The wind rustled through the ivy along the stone walls. Candles flickered in sconces, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts through the corridors. In the corridor outside the main drawing room, Nate Booker carried a tray of brandy glasses, his steps careful, his mind on letters and lessons, and the way Clara had smiled at him with kindness he had never earned. He paused when he heard voices behind the partially closed door. Vivian's voice. "I don't care how useful she's been," she said, her tone sharp and cold. "She doesn't belong here. She's a stain on this house." Mrs. Graves replied, her voice steady. "If she is who I believe she is, then it's worse than you think." Vivian's heels clicked on the floor. "Then we'll expose her. Let Edward see her for what she truly is." "Are you certain he will care?" Mrs. Graves asked. There was a pause. Vivian's voice dropped, trembling not with fear, but with fury. He must care. He will have to care. If not, everything I've built disappears. The clink of glass. The finality of a decision made. Nate backed away slowly, his heart thundering in his chest. He found Clara in the servants' quarters, sitting on her cot with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her brooch was in her hand, the light of the oil lamp making it glow softly in her palm. She looked up when he entered. I heard them, he whispered. They're going to tell everyone. Clara didn't move. Her face was still. I have to leave, she said, her voice calm, before I bring ruin to the very place that saved me. Nate stepped forward. You didn't ruin anything. They're afraid of what they don't understand. I carry a name soaked in disgrace, Nate. That fear is not unjustified. He looked at her, really looked at her, and then, with quiet urgency, he said, Let me help. Clara closed her fingers around the brooch. No, she whispered. You've already helped enough. And in her voice, there was not only sorrow, there was farewell. The house shimmered with gold that evening. Candelabras gleamed on every polished surface, casting their trembling light over brocade tablecloths and porcelain plates rimmed in gold. Crystal glasses glistened like droplets of glass tears, each one filled with wine as dark as secrets. The great chandelier above the dining hall spilled brilliance across a room prepared to impress, seduce, and dominate. It was the grandest dinner Langston House had hosted in years. Charleston's finest were in attendance, landowners and politicians. Bankers and their carefully powdered wives, a judge, a bishop, several young debutantes with starved eyes and tightly corseted dreams. The room pulsed with the weight of status and scrutiny, and presiding over it all, as if seated upon an invisible throne, was Duchess Vivian Ashcroft, draped in midnight blue satin with sapphire stones glinting at her throat like warnings. Her posture was exquisite, her tone musical, her every glance measured for effect. She welcomed each guest with practiced charm, spoke with deliberate elegance, and sipped her wine slowly, like a queen awaiting the exact moment to deliver judgment. Edward Langston sat at her right hand. His face, handsome and still, betrayed no emotion. Yet behind his eyes brewed a storm too tightly caged. He spoke little, he drank more than usual, and he watched the door, because Clara had been ordered to serve. She entered the hall not as a guest, not as a woman, but as a shadow behind the silver trays. Her uniform had been pressed, her hands scrubbed raw, her hair tucked beneath the plain cap that stole the last hint of her former self. And yet, she moved with dignity. Each step was precise, each gesture calm. She did not tremble, though she felt the heat of every gaze that followed her. She could feel Vivian's smile cutting across the room like a blade dipped in sugar. The meal began. Soup, then fish. Conversations swelled, laughter echoed. Clara moved silently between the tables, refilling glasses and offering platters. She avoided Edward's gaze, though she felt it like fire. And then, during the second course, Vivian gently tapped her glass with a silver fork. The clear chime silenced the room. "May I speak," she said with a poised smile, "of something rather curious that has recently come to my attention?" The guests turned to her with indulgent curiosity. She continued, her voice smooth as cream. "This estate, as you all know, prides itself on elegance, tradition, and a certain pedigree of discretion, which is why I found it so fascinating to discover that one of the maids has quite the lineage of her own." Clara froze mid-step. Vivian turned her gaze toward Mrs. Penelope Graves, who stood near the sideboard with arms folded and eyes sharp. "Would you do the honors, Mrs. Graves?" The housekeeper stepped forward, the candlelight catching the glint of something in her hand. She held it aloft, a brooch, small and delicate, gold-framed with a faintly carved crest. "I found this in her belongings," Mrs. Graves said, her voice steady and cold. The same crest linked to the scandal of Elias Whitlow, a man accused of art fraud who took his own life to escape trial. His daughter disappeared afterward, until now. A collective gasp rippled across the table. She has been living under this roof, Mrs. Graves continued, under false pretenses. A Whitlow, daughter of a forger, hidden among us. Clara stood still, the silver tray still in her hands, though her fingers had turned white around its edges. Whispers ignited like dry brush. The Whitlow scandal. Dear God, I remember that name. She served us? Vivian leaned back in her chair, the corners of her mouth lifted in quiet triumph. It's one thing to shelter the destitute, another entirely to harbor the legacy of deceit. Clara looked to Edward. He said nothing. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the floor, frozen. And in that silence, something inside Clara broke, not with a cry, but with a hush, a final, irrevocable quiet. She placed the tray gently on the nearest table. Then, with slow, precise hands, she untied the white apron from her waist, folded it neatly, and laid it beside the crystal glasses. She stood tall, her cap still in place, her eyes dry. I ask no forgiveness, she said, her voice clear and resonant. I sought none when I arrived, and I seek none now. I was not born to be a servant, but I served. I did not steal, I did not lie, I lived. And then, without waiting for permission or dismissal, Clara turned and walked out of the hall, out of the house, into the rain. Because outside, the skies had broken. It was a storm not unlike the one that had brought her to Langston House in the first place. Heavy, wild, relentless. The kind of rain that scours the world clean. She did not run. She walked through the gardens, past the rose beds, now bowed with water, past the stables, toward the iron gate that led to the forest beyond. Nate was already there, waiting with a bundle under his coat. I thought you might need this, he said, breathless, as he handed her a cloak and a pouch of bread and coins. His hands trembled, but his eyes burned with loyalty. Clara took the cloak, her voice soft. Thank you, Nate, for everything. You shouldn't be alone out there. I've been alone a long time, she said with a small, sad smile. I'll manage. She reached out, placed a hand over his, and gave it a gentle squeeze. Then she turned and slipped through the gate, the rain cloaking her in shadow as she vanished into the night. Hours passed. The guests had long departed, the dishes cleared, the wine dried to crimson ghosts in the glasses. Langston House stood silent, a monument of pride now cracking at the edges. Edward sat alone in the library, the fire before him untouched. He had not spoken since she left. He had not moved. And then, as if his lungs finally remembered to breathe, he stood. Without a coat, without an umbrella, he walked through the house like a man possessed, down the hall, past the dining room, through the kitchen, toward the back gate. But the rain met him with silence, and the path was empty. She was gone. The storm had eased by morning, but its echo lingered in every branch and puddle and sigh of wind that passed through the trees surrounding Charleston. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, wood smoke, and regret. Rainwater clung to the rooftops like unshed tears, and the sky remained a canvas of quiet grey, neither promising light nor threatening darkness. At the edge of the town, tucked between a grove of cypress trees and a forgotten cemetery, stood a small church. Its stone walls were cracked and weathered, its roof sagging in places, but its doors remained open, as if mercy, though tired, still had a place to offer. Clara sat in the second pew from the front. She did not pray. Her hands were folded, not in devotion, but in stillness. Her cloak was damp, her hair hung in wet curls around her temples, and her boots, worn through at the soles, rested against the uneven stone floor with an air of finality. She had not spoken since she arrived hours earlier. The priest had offered her tea and dry linens and asked no questions. There was peace in the silence. She looked up toward the stained glass window above the altar, where the pale light filtered through an image of Mary cradling the Christ child. The colors had faded over time, the glass chipped in one corner, yet still the figure held her burden with quiet grace. Clara closed her eyes, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it all. The shame, the betrayal, the loss. The moment her father died, everything that had tethered her to the world had unraveled. Not just wealth, not just comfort, but belonging, purpose, name. She had become something people whispered about, a stain upon a canvas she had not painted. She had fled not to escape punishment, but to preserve what little remained of her own dignity. And now, even that had been stripped from her. This time not by a judge, but by a dinner table and a silence that had cut deeper than words. The doors creaked behind her. She knew the sound before she turned. Edward Langston stepped into the chapel, his boots leaving faint marks on the damp stone. His coat was soaked, clinging to his frame, his hair darkened by the mist outside. He looked like a man who had walked for hours, and perhaps he had. He paused when he saw her. She did not rise, she did not speak. He approached slowly, the heels of his boots echoing like heartbeats in the vaulted silence. When he reached her pew, he remained standing. For a long moment they simply looked at one another. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't know where else to look." Clara's voice was soft. "Then I'm glad you found me." He sat beside her, though he did not turn to face her. His hands rested on his knees, clenched. "I should have said something," he said, barely above a whisper. "At the dinner." "You said everything by saying nothing," she replied. His jaw tightened. Clara looked ahead, eyes focused on the flickering votive candles near the altar. "You don't owe me an apology, Edward. I understand." "No," he said, "you don't." He turned toward her then, and in his eyes she saw the storm that had not passed. Not outside, but within. "I didn't speak because I didn't know how to stand between you and everything I was raised to protect. Because I was afraid, not of you, but of what it would mean to choose you." Clara blinked, her throat tightening. "And I hate myself for it," he said, his voice rough, "for standing still while they humiliated you, while I watched you walk away." She exhaled slowly. "You were raised to be a pillar, a symbol, not a man." "I want to be a man again," he said, "but I don't know how to do that without destroying everything around me." She turned to him at last, her gaze steady. "My father wasn't perfect," she began. "He was brilliant and passionate and deeply flawed. He let pride lead him into ruin. He lied to protect those he loved, and when the world turned on him, he fell, hard and alone. I've carried his shadow every day since, but the truth is, I still loved him." Her voice broke slightly. "I loved the way he saw beauty in things no one else noticed. I loved how he painted my mother's face with such reverence that it felt like prayer. I loved how he taught me to look at the world not with judgment but with curiosity. That man was not a criminal to me. He was my father." Edward listened without interruption. "And when he died," Clara continued, "the world expected me to vanish with him, to disappear. I did, but not because I was guilty, because no one wanted to remember what he left behind." She looked down at her hands. "I never asked you to fight for me, Edward. I only hoped you would see me." His breath caught. "I see you now," he whispered. "I see the strength in your silence, the fire you've never allowed yourself to burn. I see the woman who faced a room of predators and walked out with her dignity intact." Clara's lips trembled. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Their fingers intertwined slowly, gently, like a promise too delicate to speak aloud. "I never loved Vivian," he said. Clara looked up, her eyes wide. "I thought I could," he went on. "I told myself it was duty, that marriage would solidify the estate, fulfill my father's expectations, secure my name. But I never looked at her the way I looked at you. I never stayed awake wondering what she feared or what she dreamed of." He leaned closer, his voice a thread. "You've haunted me, Clara Whitlow." The chapel seemed to still around them. Even the wind outside had hushed, and then, slowly, achingly, their foreheads met. The kiss that followed was not stolen or desperate. It was soft, slow, a meeting of pain and tenderness, of everything they had buried and everything they had dared not name. When they parted, Clara's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I can't ask you to choose me," she said. "Not if it means tearing down the world you've built." Edward brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You don't have to ask," he replied. "But I still need time. There are things I must make right first." Clara nodded. "Then go." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but the weight of responsibility returned to his face like a familiar mask. He rose. "I'll come back," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "I'll believe you." He turned and walked to the doors. Outside, the rain had begun again, not with fury, but with softness, a steady, cleansing rhythm. Clara remained in the pew, her fingers still warm from his touch. She did not know what would come next, but for the first time in years, she did not feel ashamed to hope. Far away, in a quiet corner of Langston House, Nate Booker sealed a letter with trembling fingers. He had spent the last 2 days tracking down names, comparing crests, and piecing together truths no one wanted spoken. He had found a man in Charleston who remembered Elias Whitlow's last commissions, and another who claimed to know the truth behind the forgeries. Nate didn't understand everything, but he understood this: Clara deserved her name back, and he would see that she got it. The morning sun filtered through Langston House with all the warmth of a smile that no longer reached the eyes. The estate, once an orchestra of quiet routines and veiled glances, now hummed with tension, low, steady, and unbearable. In the great drawing room, the polished floors reflected a woman poised to strike. Vivian Ashcroft stood by the window, her gloved hands folded behind her back. The sapphire ring on her right finger glinted each time it caught the light, but it was not the ring that drew attention. It was her silence. Edward entered without ceremony. He did not bow, he did not smile, and he did not apologize. Vivian turned slowly. She wore a gown the color of storm clouds, a high-necked bodice embroidered with black jet beads, and her raven hair was pinned in such perfect precision that it looked sculpted, not grown. "You've kept me waiting," she said. "I was deciding how much longer I intended to pretend," he replied. Her chin lifted. "Pretend?" Edward walked to the center of the room, the distance between them more than spatial. "We both know what this arrangement is," he said. "A transaction, an inheritance of convenience. You desire the title. I needed the alliance. And now?" she asked coolly. "Now I find I can no longer endure the cost." Vivian stepped forward slowly, the train of her gown trailing like spilled ink. "If you break the engagement now," she said, voice calm but laced with venom, "I will ensure your creditors come calling by morning. Your estate is not as secure as it appears, Edward. I know of the debts your father concealed, the letters he wrote to the bank in Savannah. I've seen them. I can make them very public." He did not flinch. "I will not marry you," he said, not loudly but finally. Her green eyes narrowed. "Then you choose ruin." "I choose peace," he answered, for the first time. Vivian's mouth curved into something like a smile, but it was hollow. "You think Charleston society will forgive you? That they'll embrace your little scandal? That they'll accept a servant girl with a forged name as the mistress of Langston House?" Edward's voice was calm. "I think they'll tire of your bitterness before they tire of my honesty." She blinked, just once, but it was enough. With slow elegance, she reached for her gloves, slipping them off finger by finger. "Then you've made your choice." "I have." She turned toward the door, her voice low. "Then may your house fall quietly." And she left. Edward did not move for a long while. The room felt colder in her absence, but not empty. Something else remained, something tender, something real. A knock came at the door. It was Nate. The young stable hand stood at the threshold, holding an envelope in his calloused hands. His freckles were darker than usual, as if anxiety had drawn them out from his skin. "This came for you," he said. Edward took the envelope, breaking the seal with care. Inside was a single page, no more than 10 lines written in firm, fading ink, from the Charleston Guild of Artisans. A statement of confession, signed and notarized. The late Henley Bancroft, a former rival of Elias Whitlow, had, on his deathbed, confessed to framing Elias to protect his own failing career. The forged paintings had been his work, the lies his survival tactic. Elias Whitlow had been innocent. Edward read the letter twice, then once more aloud, his voice low and reverent as though reciting a scripture. When he looked up, Nate's eyes were wet. "She deserves to know," Nate said. "She deserves to hear it from you." Edward nodded once, sharply, and then he was gone. He did not wait for a carriage. He did not send word ahead. He rode fast, dust curling behind him like smoke. Meanwhile, on the other side of Charleston, the world looked very different. Clara stood at the edge of a narrow clearing beside a one-room schoolhouse nestled between a stand of willow trees and a low, winding creek. The building was modest, whitewashed wood with peeling paint and crooked shutters, but inside, something sacred stirred. Children sat cross-legged on the worn plank floor, their eyes wide, their faces alight with the glow of possibility. Many had never touched a book, some had never spoken aloud in front of others, but today they read. Clara knelt beside a girl no older than 7, her finger guiding the child's along each word in the primer. "Cat," the girl whispered. Clara smiled. "Very good." She moved to the next child, then the next, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as the warmth of the afternoon settled over the room. Her hands were stained with chalk, her hair pulled back with a ribbon someone had left on her desk. She wore no jewelry, no fine gloves, and yet she glowed with purpose. When the lesson ended, the children dispersed in pairs and small groups, barefoot and laughing. Clara remained, erasing the board slowly, her fingers tracing the faint remains of the word hope. She stepped outside just as the wind picked up. A storm was gathering again. Clouds darkened the edges of the sky, curling like old grief returning. The air was charged, heavy with the scent of coming rain. And then, hoofbeats. She turned. Edward appeared, soaked from the ride, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes searching, wild with urgency. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, his boots landing in the red dust, his breath ragged. Clara froze. He walked to her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat. He handed her the letter. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the page. She read each word, and then read it again. She said nothing. Her eyes glistened. Her shoulders rose once with a breath so deep it might have been a sob, but no sound escaped her. "I thought you should hear it from me," Edward said. "Not from the wind, not from gossip, from me." Clara looked up, her voice a whisper. "He was innocent." Edward nodded. "Yes." She folded the letter with reverence, as if tucking away a piece of her soul long exiled. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything. I don't know who I am anymore." "You're Clara," he said, "not because he was your father, not because they accused him, but because you survived, because you taught a child to read today." She blinked hard. "I'm not who I was," she said. "I don't want who you were," he said. "I want who you are." But Clara stepped back, the letter still clutched to her chest. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "Not from you, not from anyone." "I'm not here to forgive," Edward replied. "I'm here to begin." The first raindrop fell, then another. She turned her face toward the sky, and for the first time in years, she let the rain touch her without fear, without hiding, without shame. Behind her, on the school's modest porch, Nate watched quietly, a slow smile forming. Inside, on the blackboard, the word hope remained, faint but still visible. The past had been rewritten, not by denial, but by truth. And the truth, finally, had come home. 1 week later, the skies wept again. Charleston lay beneath a soft curtain of rain, not a storm this time, but a steady, thoughtful drizzle, as if the heavens, remembering the wounds of those below, chose not to rage, but to mourn gently. At the edge of the clearing, the small white schoolhouse stood brave against the grey morning. The building, humble in every beam and crack, exhaled warmth through its windows. Inside, young voices danced through the air, reciting lines of poetry with faltering pride. Clara stood just beneath the eaves, watching. A woven shawl rested lightly on her shoulders, already speckled with rain. Her dress was simple cotton, the hem damp from where it brushed the wet grass. Her hair had been tied back in a loose knot, though strands had escaped, curling in the damp air. She held herself with the grace of someone no longer hiding. Under the porch roof, she watched her students, half barefoot, half laughing, repeat the final stanza of a poem she had once whispered to herself in a time when silence was her only companion. And still she danced, though none could hear, the music born of pain and cheer. The children stumbled over the last words, giggling, proud of their progress. Clara smiled, her hands folded in front of her, her heart aching with something unfamiliar and whole. It wasn't peace, not entirely. But it was its beginning. The rain grew heavier, drops struck the roof like 1,000 heartbeats, soft and persistent, then hoofbeats. She turned her head slowly. At the far edge of the road, emerging like a ghost from the mist, came a black horse, and on it, a man, Edward Langston. He rode with purpose, but without haste. His coat was soaked through, the tails clinging to his thighs, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He dismounted before reaching the steps, walking the last distance with heavy boots sinking into the mud. He stopped 3 paces from her. Neither spoke. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Edward removed his hat slowly. His eyes found hers through the veil of rain. And for a moment he looked not like the master of Langston House, not like the heir of lineage and duty, but like a man who had walked through every storm in search of something he thought he would never find again. "I thought perhaps you might not come," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I thought I might come too soon," he replied. Their eyes locked, a current of memory and feeling crackling between them. Clara glanced past him toward the road. A small carriage waited nearby. The door was closed. The driver remained still, and only a sliver of movement betrayed the presence of someone inside. Edward followed her gaze. "She insisted on coming," he said. Clara's brows lifted slightly. "She?" He nodded. "Mrs. Graves." Clara said nothing. Her heart was too full to allow surprise. Perhaps, like all things long buried, even judgment could be softened by truth. Edward stepped closer. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, withdrawing a small velvet pouch, dark blue and dampened by the rain. He held it out. Clara hesitated. "What is this?" she asked, though the question already lived in her eyes. He opened the pouch himself, revealing a ring. Gold. Simple. With a single opal set in a nest of delicate filigree. Not a jewel of grandeur, but of sentiment. The kind of ring that held not wealth but memory. "It was my mother's," Edward said. "She wore it every day, even when society insisted she wear diamonds instead." Clara stared at it, unblinking. "She told me once," he continued, "that love, if it came, should be chosen in silence, not screamed from balconies or sealed in contracts, but in rain, in the quiet, when no one is watching." He took her hand. "I am not a man offering rescue," he said. "I have nothing to save you from." A pause. "I offer you only this, that I see you, and I choose you, not because the world forgives you, but because I never stopped longing for the woman who stood in a storm, unbowed." Clara's eyes filled slowly. The rain tapped gently against the roof, as if listening. From the porch, Nate watched with a hand resting on the railing. He did not speak. He only smiled, quietly, gratefully. Inside the carriage, Mrs. Graves sat with her gloved hands resting on her lap. She watched the scene unfold with a face carved of stone, but her eyes, always stern, had softened. She did not step down. She did not interrupt. She simply bore witness. Clara looked down at the ring in Edward's palm. The opal glistened with the reflection of her tears. "You choose me," she whispered. "After everything." He nodded. Again and again, if you'll let me. Her voice trembled. I have no dowry, no name, no place. Edward leaned closer. Then let us make one, he said, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but like something meant to be shaped over time. Clara looked up, her face tilted toward the rain, her eyes shining. She took his face gently in her hands, and though she did not yet kiss him, her touch was everything he had waited for. A declaration, a prayer, a home. The sky above them began to clear, just faintly. The clouds parted as though reluctant to give way, but willing to witness. A sliver of light broke through, catching the gold on her hand and turning it to fire. In the silence that followed, she whispered one word, yes. And in that word was everything. Redemption, love, rebirth. The children clapped from inside, unaware of what they were witnessing. But the world knew. Langston House would remember this day not for titles or dowries or silks, but for the moment its master chose at last to live not by inheritance, but by heart. And the girl once named a scandal stood no longer in shame. She stood in reign, chosen, whole. The air was thick with wisteria and memory. Langston House stood unchanged to most eyes. Its columns still cast long shadows at dusk, and its windows gleamed beneath the southern sun. But those who knew it well, those who had watched it in silence and sorrow, would have noticed the difference. The silence was gone. Laughter now echoed through its halls, high-pitched, unrestrained, and often followed by the thunder of small feet on polished floors. On the southern lawn, beneath the outstretched arms of an ancient magnolia, Clara Langston sat on a quilt, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her hair was pulled back in a loose twist, streaked now with hints of silver, though her face held the same calm dignity it had always worn. Time had softened her, but had not erased her fire. If anything, it burned deeper now, quiet, steady, enduring. Beside her sat a boy of 7, with storm-grey eyes and a mop of chestnut curls. He rested against her side, one hand holding a worn book, the other curled around her fingers. "Read it again, Mama," he whispered. Clara smiled. One more page. A little girl, younger by 3 years, darted across the lawn with muddy stockings and a crown of daisies in her hair. She was all sunlight and wildness, with a laugh that could fracture silence like stained glass underfoot. From the porch, Edward Langston watched them with eyes that held the weight of all he had almost lost. His hair had gone silver at the temples, but his presence was still commanding. He no longer wore duty like armor. He wore love like linen, fitted, lived in, true. He descended the steps and crossed the lawn slowly, his boots brushing through the grass. He stopped behind Clara, leaned down, and kissed the top of her head. "Guests are arriving," he said softly. Clara looked up. "Already?" He nodded. "Nate sent word. The first schoolmaster from the Freedmen's Academy is here. He brought his eldest son. Says he remembers you from the schoolhouse." She placed her tea aside and stood, smoothing her skirt. That little white schoolhouse had become something far greater. In the years following the scandal's quiet death and Clara's quiet vindication, Edward had donated land and funds to expand what Clara had begun with only a chalkboard and her heart. Now, the Whitlow Langston Academy for Freed Children stood as a proud monument to second chances, and not a soul in Charleston could speak against it, not after the Guild's public statement. Not after Edward stood beside Clara and let the world see where his loyalty lived. Nate Booker had become the first headmaster. He married a schoolteacher from Savannah and now had 4 children, all named after writers or saints, depending on who told the story. He still visited Langston House every week, always carrying a book, always with dust on his boots. And Mrs. Penelope Graves, once the house's sharpest tongue and hardest judge, remained. She never apologized to Clara aloud, but she showed it in other ways, in how she held Clara's children when they cried, in how she folded their linens with extra care, and in how she once called Clara dear when she thought no one was listening. Her hair was fully white now, her steps slower. but her eyes were still watchful and her silence still carried meaning. Not everyone had remained. Vivian Ashcroft had fled Charleston the season after Edward broke the engagement. She sold her estate, rumored to be bankrupt despite her pride. Some said she married a French baron in exile. Others whispered she lived alone, haunting a villa on the Riviera like a ghost wrapped in sapphire. No one in Charleston mourned her departure, but Clara, in her quieter moments, sometimes wondered if Vivian had loved Edward in her own way, or if she had simply loved the idea of never losing. The world outside their gates had changed too. Voices once silenced had begun to rise, slowly, fearfully, but they rose. Education, equity, dignity, these were no longer distant dreams. They were seeds scattered in soil, once hardened by pride and fear, and Clara, without grand speeches or titles, had helped them bloom. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting golden halos on the grass, Edward lifted his daughter in his arms, spinning her once before placing her gently on his shoulders. She shrieked with delight, her daisy crown toppling. "I'm taller than the house now," she declared. "Then you must be queen of it," he answered. Clara watched them, her son leaning into her side again. "Will you always read to us?" he asked. She kissed his forehead. "As long as there are words left in the world." The bell rang at the front gate. Clara turned, her heart full. 8 years had passed, but some things, the things that mattered most, had not faded. They had deepened. They had endured. Love, she had learned, was not always loud. It was not always swift. It did not always arrive clean or easy, but when it was true, when it was chosen, it rooted itself like the magnolia outside the nursery window. And even through storms it held, always. There are stories that entertain, and there are stories that leave a mark. Clara and Edward's journey was not just a tale of forbidden love or second chances. It was a story about dignity, resilience, and the power of choosing love, even when the world says you shouldn't. It reminded us that the past does not define us, that silence can be braver than noise, and that redemption often begins in the quiet places, like a schoolroom, a chapel, or a garden after the rain. If this story moved you, even just a little, I invite you to pause and reflect. Which part touched your heart the most? What would you have done in Clara's place? Would you have waited like Edward did? Let us know in the comments. Your words keep this world alive. And if you made it all the way to the end, write Magnolia in the comments. It's our secret word to know who stood with Clara in the rain, who walked with Edward through silence, and who believed in the beauty of stories like this. If you'd like to support the team that brings these tales to life, you can now send a super thanks. Any amount you feel inspired to give makes a world of difference and helps us continue creating these unforgettable journeys. But if now isn't the moment to support us financially, that's okay, truly. Sharing this story with someone you care about, someone who might need a little hope or a bit of light, is just as meaningful. It's another way to say, I believe in stories. And if you'd like to stay in this world of deep emotions, timeless romance, and enduring truths, don't miss the other period dramas I'm leaving for you in the cards above. You might just find your next favorite love story waiting there. Thank you for walking with us through this one. Until the next.